10 trillion plus is next as far as the new number of monetary units, and you think that within 3 years we're probably looking at over 10% official
Yeah.
inflation in the US. Yeah, I think those are bold claims, but I think if you understand that the problem is not the captain steering the ship, but it's an engineering problem of the ship itself,
Yeah.
I think it's becomes a lot more reasonable, and I tend to agree with you.
Yeah. I think by like
You
27,
mhm.
by 2027, you should probably see like double. And in the meantime, what's really gonna like make me sound like out there is you could see like deep deflationary forces in 2024. Like you could see their CPI prints go deeply negative in 2024 and maybe even into 2025. But I think once they respond to it, the amount that they're going to have to respond to it with is going to be so destructive to the economy, to anybody that can like compete with the Googles, Apples, and like the dominant players that are just sucking up liquidity and value out of the system. You can't even compete with these players, and like they're the balance sheets of some of these players are like bigger than countries, like GDPs and stuff. So like you're at an end game where like the going back to the bloodletting, like the body is now saying, okay, I need like the whole cell needs to be nothing but mitochondria. The lungs need to be the size of the person's entire chest. And like there's a couple things that are being optimized for the body, and it's just like it's a fatality at that point. And that's what's
Yeah.
happening with the economy.
Yeah, so all of this is based on history of the last few decades. You mentioned a couple times now, M2 on a log scale. You mentioned stocks earlier about how stocks is one of these things that's getting bid up. And this is one of the things actually in my very first thread, all the way back in January, the one that you saw that eventually, got me on your podcast, right? Got me on your show. This was something in my very first thread here. I pulled it up for us to look at and show our viewers here. But in the blue line, we have what
Love
Preston's
this.
been talking about. Thank you. But yeah, we have the blue line, what Preston's talking about. Money supply in blue on a logarithmic scale, right? So again, that's talking 10, 100,000 units of 10, not units of, one, two, three. And then we also have on the green line, we have the S&P 500, which is, the US stock market basically. So even though this chart's about, 10, 11 months old now, obviously the point's the same. This is going all the way back out to the early 1970s, 1970, 1971. So, Preston, obviously, when we look at this, we see periods where the stocks go up over the line, like the dot-com bubble here in 2000. We can see that. And then later on, the great financial crisis where it goes down and briefly, um, you know, briefly for like this 10-year period is flatlined. Basically, the decade is flat. But
Yeah.
in the long term, it's just going up and doing this. So in the future, I guess my question to you with this is why do you so many people talk about how they think it's going to go off the rails and hyperinflation or whatever is possible. But I look at those last 50 years and it seems like stable bloodletting. So why do you think if we're having this slow, stable, you know, bloodletting, why do you think it could go off the rails, or maybe you don't think it would go off the rails? Like when you look at that chart, what do you think? What do
Well,
you think in 50 years from now? Yeah.
what you're not seeing in that chart is the domination of the top equity holders in of the S&P 500,
The
right?
big seven, right?
Yeah, the big seven. So like if you went back and you looked very early in the chart, right? And I love I usually don't like charts where the y-axis is on the left and the right side, and because
Yeah.
sometimes it can be distorted. But in this particular chart, it's actually quite awesome because it's a 10-to-1 ratio. Like if you look over at
Mm-hmm.
30 trillion, it's 3K. If you look at the 10 trillion, it's almost equivalent to your 1K. If you look at the 4 trillion, it's equivalent to your 400. So like it's very proportional, a 10-to-1 ratio between the money supplied growth and the S&P 500. And if you were going to ask me what would be the best way for a person to protect against this quote unquote 7% debasement rate of M2 through that period of time, I would tell you the NASDAQ, I would tell you the S&P 500. You'd have to own like the top dominating equities in the world to protect yourself just from the debasement of the currency itself. So to answer your question, Like, what is it that we're not seeing that happened over that period of time that when we play it forward from here, that people aren't prepared for? It's that, going back to the bloodletting example, the lungs are the size of the entire chest. The mitochondria, there's nothing left to even, you can't even put DNA in the cell anymore because there's so many mitochondria in every cell that it's the only thing that's left. And so when we look at the S&P 500, if we could market cap weight just the 10 companies, the top 10 companies in the 500, it would drive the entire indice. But if you went back when we went onto the petrodollar system, that would not have been the scenario, where you would have saw a much more homogeneous amount of businesses that made up the overall S&P 500 index. So as you continue to play this forward and you continue to debase 7% on an exponential curve, what you're finding is that all of that value accretion is pouring itself into only a few hands, which makes I use this example. I swear to God, I feel like I use this example in every single interview, and I'm tired of using it, but it's the only way I can get the point through. It'd be like a forest. It would be like a predator totally dominating its environment so that there's no creatures left for it to feast on. Okay. And you know what happens in those environments? The predator eventually kills itself because it literally ate and devoured everything in its environment. That's where this is going. It's like the whole system is becoming extremely unstable because all value accretion is manifesting itself into the hands of just a few parties. And that is a very extremely unstable ecosystem environment for business, for free and open markets. Why do you think that there's an attack on capitalism right now? Is because A, we don't have capitalism. A, we have an environment where government is stepping in and just totally like a puppeteer, like controlling where these funds flow. And so people who are saying capitalism is a failing model and isn't fair to everybody, well, my response to that person is, so you think this is capitalism right now? Like, this isn't capitalism.
Yeah. Money is the largest quote unquote market in the world, right? And that's not a free market, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've said this on a lot of interviews as well, which is just like the price of everything on the planet. I don't care if you're talking about some chapstick or you're talking about some beef that you went and bought, or you're talking about a car you just went and purchased. It all comes down to the cost of capital, the cost of money. Okay. The cost of money for anybody that like, if you're a billionaire and you've played this game really well and you have all this, all these assets, I can tell you right now, no billionaire on this planet would ever do an investment that's not giving them at least 7 or 8%. They won't do it, because whether they realize that that's the M2 growth rate or not, which many of them might not realize that that's like the real debasement rate. Okay. So many will, but if they don't, they intuitively understand that that's their hurdle rate that they have to outperform to grow their capital base. They have to.
No.
Yeah. And so if we looked at the S&P 500, or we look at stocks right now, most of them are priced at like a 3 or 4% return if you buy them right now. So like if you buy them at their current price, you're underperforming just the M2 growth rate by like, call it 4%, because of how they're priced right now. Now, if they go screaming down, like, well, you had a little bit of a buying opportunity where you had better PE ratios, which would bring that more in line with just keeping pace with the debasement rate. I would argue right now, like pretty much anything that's a large cap or mid cap, like you are underperforming just the debasement rate of 7 or 8% by 3 or 4%.
That's crazy. That's crazy. It's this whole, and I talked about this when I came on your show too, about it, the incentives are aligned in that way to where we have to continue centralizing. You talked about why Why is there more and more hate against capitalism? Why is there more and more centralization? Why all these things? You mentioned earlier about how this large sector in the United States is the financial management regulation. It's like the biggest industry in the world is that monopoly of
Yeah.
trying to either control or try to predict and be ahead of the control of that cost of capital as everything continues to centralize more and more and more. So
Yeah. Well,
I
and to
have
the point of the one other thing that I was trying to say, but I
mhm,
forgot to say on the cost of capital.
mhm,
If you're manipulating the cost of capital, you're effectively doing price controls for everything. So like
mm,
going back to the vehicle, the beef or the chapstick, like you're trying to control the price of all of that stuff simultaneously.
mhm,
Everybody knows that when you step into a market and you try to control the price of a specific thing, that you're actually causing that ecosystem to operate less efficiently. And a lot of people use like the generator example of like price controls on generators during like a flood or something like that. Like the most efficient way that you can manage those generators to get to where they need to go is by not implementing price controls, because they'll start charging higher prices, and the people that desperately need those generators for whatever reason are going to pay up to own them. So you can argue that in that emergency scenario, those generators are going to go where they're needed most holistically across that ecosystem by not stepping in and adjusting the price. And so when we're playing around with the cost of capital, we're playing around with the price of everything, which means we're making everything less efficient and less, value accretive for the whole.